The third person pronoun is your he, she, it in the singular and the they in the plural. And so in the subject case or the nominative case, he, she, it, and they, those are your four forms for the subject case. But if you're using it as an object in a sentence, you would have to use him, her, it, and them, right? And if you needed the possessive form of it, then that would be his, her, its, and their. So the main problem that we come across when talking about the third person in writing is this issue of, should we say he or she, or should we say they? What pronoun is appropriate to use? Or should we say he, she, or, he, s/he, or, there are a lot of these different options. So let's consider that issue. So we get a sentence like this. Okay, let's read the sentence. If you allow your government to take control over all aspects of your life, then you leave, sorry, there's a little error there. You leave yourself vulnerable against the potential corruption of your elected officials in the government. All right, so nice long sentence, very meaningful, very formal sounding. So it sounds like a good sentence to put in an essay, except you got this you problem. And we talked about that in the last video, that you is discouraged by the teachers, and all English teachers will tell you not to use you in this situation in essays in general. And so what should you do? Well, one option is to say one in that situation. And that's a third person singular pronoun. One is not a personal pronoun. It's called an indefinite pronoun, but it is an appropriate pronoun to use in that situation. And then you get to change into something like this. If one allows one's government to take control over one's life, then one leaves oneself vulnerable, blah, blah, to one's elected officials. A lot of ones there, right? So it doesn't look pretty, and it's a little awkward. It's not very smooth when you're reading it. So this, I would strongly discourage you from doing this. This is not good style. The one is acceptable at the beginning. But the other ones, since we mentioned a particular person, this should become the antecedent for the future pronouns. And so it should be something like his government here, and his life, and he leaves, and so on. Personal pronouns should take place after that. Okay? So then we get into the question of, well, should I say his? What about her? I don't want to sound sexist, so I should include her. And so back from, I believe, like 1960s and 70s, there was the feminist movement, and there was a big movement to include she and her into the language instead of just saying he and him all the time. Now, I gotta tell you that traditionally and historically, he, him, is the masculine pronoun, is the proper pronoun to use to include everybody, including women. This is just history, and that's how the language was. It's only in recent times that a lot of people have insisted on putting the she and the her in there instead of the he, as if that they were being excluded from this discussion. And that's not really the case. They are included by the pronoun. And here's the issue. If you try to include a she, the language gets very messy. So let's take a look at this sentence. If one allows his or her government to take control over all aspects of his or her life, then he or she leaves himself or herself vulnerable against the potential corruption of his or her elected officials in the government. All that he, she stuff makes you lose track of the meaning of the sentence. This is just really conflated, and it's just not a good sentence. Really messy as a sentence. So I would strongly discourage you from doing something like this. If the sentence was very short, and if you had the use of the he or her only once in the sentence, then I would find no problem if you use his or her once in a sentence. But if you had to do it 2 or 3 times in a sentence, well, this is only one sentence, but what if the sentence goes on? And there were 5 sentences like this, and you would end up using that pronoun he or she like 15 times in your paragraph. That would be a really ugly paragraph. And no professional writers would ever do that in a book or in a newspaper. Okay? And this is certainly not something you want to do in your essays. Let's look at another option. This is his, her, she. I don't know how to read that, but this was another option that has been in use in the past. This is supposed to include both the male and the female. It's just that when you overuse it, just like the other one, it just gets very ugly. How is the reader supposed to read through this? Okay, his, her, his/her. In the reader's mind, even though all the words are going through the mind, he's kind of like verbalizing everything, and it gets very difficult for the reader. This, I would discourage you. And I'm sure there are teachers out there or other experts out there who would say this is perfectly fine. You go ahead and use it. That's fine. That's their style. But I'm going to tell you that not a good idea. All right? I would discourage you from doing that. So here's another option. If one allows their government to take control over aspects of their life, then they leave themselves vulnerable. Now this reads much more smoothly, okay? And this is the option that has been opted by a lot of people, and we use this in speech. Okay, so when we talk about a certain person that's unknown, we'll use the plural form they to talk about that person because we don't want to say his or her. We want to say that this is an unspecified person, and since we don't have a particular pronoun for an unspecified gender, we'll use the plural form, and it is accepted by the listeners as such. And since the listeners understand it, now this has become the commonly accepted form. No one will complain if you say things this way, except in writing. When it comes to strict grammar rules, especially on the SAT, I don't think, for the longest time, they've always tested on this rule. If you start with a singular pronoun, you may not change to a plural pronoun like this. And this has always been considered an error on the SAT. And I don't think they've changed that. This is kind of like the hard set rule in grammar. So this is discouraged, but still very much acceptable in speech and acceptable to a lot of teachers, I'm sure. Okay, but strict grammar sense in writing, you should avoid that. Another thing is, it does get into the issue of, like, here we're talking about one person if one allows, but when you get to here, their life, shouldn't you say their lives if you're using the plural form their? We want to say their lives, but we know it's one person, so we end up saying their life, and it gets into that kind of problem. So let's check out a different option. If one allows his government to take control over all aspects of his life, then he leaves himself vulnerable. Okay, this I would say is the best version. This is the traditionally accepted version, just to go with the his. All right, so the very first time you use the one, and anytime after that referring to that person, the one becomes the antecedent for that the following pronouns. Okay, everything goes back to that one person. We know it's a singular person. In the singular third person, we would use the he and his. And that does include the women. If you don't like the fact that it's only the he, then you may perfectly fine to say her government, her life, and she leaves. And this is perfectly fine. Now, using the she and her includes the males as well. It's all inclusive, and that would be perfectly legitimate. So a general rule of thumb that I use in general is when I have to use pronouns like that for, unknown persons. Like there's a teacher and a student, and I'm making up a hypothetical. Whatever the good person is, I'll make it a she, and the bad person, I'll make it a he. So if the teacher is the nice person and the student is the troublemaker, the teacher, I'll make a she, and the student will be a he, and vice versa, either way. And if I do that, that just seems to not offend anybody. So that's a tip you might follow.